The morning Liam helped me into my coat and pressed a kiss to my forehead. At the door, he had already messaged Tara to tell her the house was free for the afternoon. I didn't know that yet. I drove south on the DVP toward my office in the financial district, holding a travel mug of coffee he'd made without being asked, thinking I was probably the luckiest woman in Toronto. That's how good he was at it. Not at loving me. At the performance of loving me. There is a difference, and I didn't learn to see it until I had no choice. I started Aldercroft Interiors when I was 29, in a rented studio above a Vietnamese restaurant on Bloor West. My first projects were small, furniture sourcing for a developer in Etobicoke, a minor residential renovation in Leslieville. By the time I was 36, the company had grown into a full property development and design firm. 43 employees, projects across the GTA, a boutique hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and a luxury residential development in Oakville with a waiting list. I had sacrificed a great deal to build it. A first relationship that couldn't survive my hours. Holidays I never took. Friendships I let thin out from neglect. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because what I built was real and mine, an understanding that matters to everything that comes later. Liam was a freelance architect when we met. Talented, genuinely, but underemployed in the particular way that happens when a person is better at the work than at selling himself. We met at a mixer at the Design Exchange on a Tuesday night in March. He was standing at the edge of the room with a glass of red wine and the expression of a man who was too proud to network and too ambitious to leave early. I introduced myself. He asked questions instead of talking about himself, which I found unusual enough to be interesting. 6 months later, we were together. A year after that, married. I offered him the role of head of project operations at Aldercroft, a few months after the wedding. It seemed logical. He understood instruction at materials and timelines, and I needed someone I trusted in that seat. He was good in the role. And I understand this now, the team around him was good, and he was skilled at inhabiting a position without drawing attention to the gap between the title and the effort. He drove the Range Rover I'd bought. He wore the Tag Heuer I'd given him on our 2nd anniversary. He wore the company name like a garment that fit him better than it should have. What I didn't fully account for was what that arrangement was doing to him, quietly, over time. The specific corrosion of a man who is handed things he hasn't earned, and who cannot acknowledge, even to himself, that that is what has happened. He was grateful in the early years. Then he was comfortable. Then, I think, he began to resent me for being the reason he was comfortable, which is a particular kind of logic I have no patience for. That was when Tara became relevant. She joined the company the previous September as a junior project coordinator. 26. From Sudbury, sharp and eager in the way people are when they've worked hard to get somewhere and know it. Liam was her direct supervisor. He mentioned her to me early on, said she had good instincts, that she'd caught an error in a subcontractor invoice that saved the company $14,000. I made a note to send her a commendation email. I was always too busy for the note. The signs arrived slowly enough that I talked myself out of each one individually. The phone that never left his hand, face down on every surface. The late evenings at the office, 2-3 times a week, always with a tidy reason attached. The flowers on a Tuesday for no occasion, the unexpected midday texts saying he was thinking of me. I know now that guilt produces sweetness. At the time, I mistook the sweetness for love. The first crack appeared in late November. Liam came home around 10:30, and when he leaned in to greet me, I caught a scent on his collar that wasn't his. Soft and powdery. The kind of fragrance from the middle shelf at Shoppers Drug Mart, between the dry shampoo and the setting sea spray. Not his Chanel. Not anything I owned. I asked about it lightly, in the tone of someone hoping to be reassured rather than answered. He laughed and said one of the junior staff had probably brushed against him during a charity furniture move. I laughed, too. We moved on. But I am not a woman who moves on without filing things away. A few weeks later, I was reviewing the RBC Visa Infinite statements I kept in a folder in my home office, a habit, from the early days of running the business, when every dollar had to be accounted for. I ran my finger down the charges and stopped at a transaction from a boutique in Yorkville I hadn't visited in months. Just over $3,000. I sat with that number for a long time. That evening, I asked Liam about it, lightly, mentioning the store by name. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, a look crossed his face that I had never seen before. Something caught and calculating. Before he smiled and told me he'd been planning a birthday surprise for February, and I'd ruined it. He laughed. I apologized for spoiling it. We moved on. The gift never came. Not for my birthday. Not at all. A month later, on an afternoon when Liam was at a site visit, I was in his home office, looking for a project contract. The filing cabinet drawer he usually kept locked was unlatched. Inside, beneath a folder of invoices, was a valet parking receipt. The date matched a day he'd told me he was at a planning commission meeting in Mississauga. The parking garage was in the Distillery District, across the city from where he'd said he'd been. The exit timestamp was 11:47 in the evening. I placed the receipt back exactly where I'd found it. That night, sitting in the spare room while he slept, I made the decision I should have made 2 months earlier. I would not ask questions. I would not make accusations I couldn't support. I would gather what I needed, and then I would act. The way I handled every difficult situation in business. The way I had survived in rooms full of people who had underestimated me. A few evenings later, I was reading in the living room when Liam stepped into his home office to take a call. He left the door mostly closed, but our house is not large. His voice carried. He was speaking quietly, but with a warmth he hadn't used with me in some time. At one point he said, in a tone that was almost amused, "Don't worry, she's at some board event until 9. She never notices anything that isn't a line item on a spreadsheet." A short laugh. Then, "That's what I'm saying. She's always working. It's like being married to a corporation." I sat very still for a moment. Then I turned the page of my book and kept reading. Being married to a corporation. I held that carefully. The way you hold something, that explains more than the speaker intended. I had built everything we lived inside. The house, the career, the life that allowed him to feel the way he felt. And in his private vocabulary, that made me a system he was navigating around. Not a person he was betraying, but an obstacle he was clever enough to manage. That understanding did not make me sad. It made me precise. Over the next 2 weeks, I installed a GPS tracker on the Range Rover, purchased at a security electronics shop on Yonge Street, installed by a mechanic I'd worked with for years and trusted completely. I contacted a digital forensics firm through my corporate lawyer to authenticate the financial records I'd been building. I quietly moved my most significant personal savings into an account in my name only. I did all of this without changing a single visible thing in our daily routine. I still made coffee in the mornings. I still asked about his day. I was very good at it. The GPS confirmed what I already knew. The Range Rover went to Muskoka twice in those 2 weeks. Once on a Thursday, when Liam told me he had a vendor meeting in Vaughan. Once on a Saturday, when he said he was playing hockey with some guys from his old firm. Both times the car sat at my private property for hours. Both times he came home relaxed and smelling of that same soft, powdery scent. The Muskoka property was mine in the most complete sense I know. I had found the lot myself, stopped on a gravel road, on a drive up the 400 and stood looking at a hillside above a lake until I was certain. I had hired the architect, approved every material, chosen the reclaimed timber and the cantilevered deck and the floor-to-ceiling glass facing north. 3 years and more money than I'd originally planned. It was the space I had designed with the shape of my own future in mind. It was supposed to be empty, waiting for spring. I drove up on a Thursday in January, telling no one. I took my Volvo. Liam had the Range Rover, as usual, and told my assistant I had a vendor meeting in Barrie. The highway north of the city was clear. The fields on both sides of the 400 were flat and white under a January sky. When I turned onto the private drive through the trees and saw the lights in the windows, something settled in my chest that felt almost like relief. The confirmation of a thing you've been bracing for is in some ways easier than the suspense. Inside, the air was wrong. The house smelled of takeout containers and cheap vanilla candles instead of cedar and fresh construction. My custom sectional had been stripped of its protective covering and buried under throw pillows I had never bought, in shades of blush and gold that made my stomach tighten. On the kitchen counter, an open bottle of rosé, a phone charger, a box of instant pasta. In the master bathroom, drugstore cosmetics lined along the marble vanity I'd had imported from Portugal. In the walk-in wardrobe, a row of clothes that weren't mine. Young clothes. Inexpensive things with aspirational tags. The kind someone buys when they want to look like they belong somewhere they don't yet. I photographed everything, methodically, without touching a thing. I moved through the space the way I would do a site inspection, which in a sense it was. The site of everything I was about to dismantle. Then I drove back to the city and called my father. Walter had built his own contracting business in Calgary in the 80s, starting with one truck and paying off his credit card before interest had a chance to accumulate. He'd retired to the Beaches neighborhood in East Toronto to be near me after my mother passed, and he spent his days in good order. His affairs exact, his expectations of people clear, his tolerance for nonsense absolute zeros. He was the person I called when I needed someone who would not flinch. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was always his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, 2 weeks, and then I need you to be somewhere with me. He said, "Tell me where." I began preparing with the calm I only feel when there is a clear objective and enough information to work from. Walter offered to come over. I told him to stay home. I didn't need company. I needed space to think and a clean plan, and I had both. Tara made her mistake on a Friday afternoon in late January. I was at my desk reviewing a contractor proposal when Zoe sent me a message with 4 words, "Open Instagram, right now." Tara had posted a reel, 20 seconds long. She was in the passenger seat of my Range Rover. I recognized the cream leather interior, the small maple leaf air freshener I'd hung from the rearview mirror after a drive to Ottawa. She was wearing sunglasses. My sunglasses, the limited edition pair I'd left in the glove compartment. The window was cracked and her hair was moving in the cold air. Highway 400 was visible behind her, stretching north toward Cottage country under a pale winter sky. She was laughing at something off camera. The caption read, "His wife thinks he's at a work thing. Muskoka bound with my person. Upgrade, sweetie." His wife thinks he's at a work thing. I read it 3 times. Not because I needed to absorb the words, but because I wanted to be precise about what I was feeling, which was not sadness and was not panic. It was a gear clicking into place. The evidence-gathering phase was over. I downloaded the video to my encrypted backup, captured the screenshot with the timestamp visible, and called my father. Walter arrived at my house that evening with a thermos of coffee and the expression he saved for the start of a difficult job. I laid out the plan. Based on their pattern, they would leave Muskoka on Sunday around 2 in the afternoon, heading south on the 400 to beat traffic. I had tracked this twice. I knew the route, I knew the timing, and I had already identified a stretch of highway about 8 kilometers south of a rest stop, a construction merge zone where 4 lanes narrowed to 2, where traffic slowed naturally, and the concrete pylons allowed no room to maneuver. Walter said he'd bring a colleague he trusted. I said that was all I needed. On Sunday, I dressed the way I always dress when I know I'm walking into something important. Dark trousers, a charcoal wool coat, clean boots, minimal makeup. Not for them, for myself. Because how you carry yourself in difficult moments is the only thing entirely within your control. We waited at the rest stop in separate vehicles. I had the GPS tracking app open on my phone. I watched the small icon that represented my Range Rover, my property, being used for someone else's pleasure, on a road they had no right to feel easy on, begin to move south. I drank nothing. I listened to CBC Radio 2 on low volume. I waited. It took just over an hour. When the Range Rover passed the rest stop, we pulled out behind it. Walter's truck came up alongside the Range Rover first. I moved in from the right. Walter cut across the front of them sharply and braked hard. I heard the shriek of tires. The Range Rover jolted to a stop between the 2 vehicles, boxed in against the pylons, with nowhere to go. I was out of my car before the rocking stopped. I walked to the passenger side. Tara was sitting very still, staring forward, hands folded in her lap. I knocked on the window once, clearly. When she didn't respond, Walter's colleague stepped forward with the entry tool, and 30 seconds later, the lock disengaged. I opened the door. Tara turned and looked at me. She said my name in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm. I noticed she was still wearing my sunglasses. I noticed that with a particular, quiet satisfaction. I told her to get out. She hesitated, and then she got out, stumbling slightly on the icy shoulder gravel and catching herself on the door frame. Around us, other cars had slowed. Phones were appearing through windshields. I didn't rush. Liam had come around from the driver's side. He was talking. The tone he used when he was managing a situation, measured and reasonable and utterly hollow. And Walter positioned himself between us without being asked. Which is the sort of thing Walter has always known to do without needing instruction. I walked to the driver's side and held out my hand. Liam stopped talking. He looked at my hand and then at my face, and I watched him understand completely. He placed the key fob into my palm. He had the expression of a man who expects someone else to tell him what happens next. For years, I had been that person. I was finished. I told him every card and account access bearing his name had been suspended as of that morning. I told him the locks at the Rosedale house had been replaced on Friday. I told him his personal items had been boxed and left in the lobby of his brother's building in Etobicoke the day before. My assistant had arranged it quietly and without incident. Around us, phones kept recording. The January wind off the fields was cutting right through them both. I noticed that too. He asked where he was supposed to go. I said that was no longer a problem I was available to solve. I got into the Range Rover. The seat was set to someone else's position. I moved it back to mine, turned on the heat, found CBC Radio 2 still preset on the display, exactly where I'd left it. I looked once in the rearview mirror, 2 people on the highway shoulder, with transport trucks rolling past, and a gray Ontario sky pressing down over all of it. And then I signaled, merged, and drove south. The rest of that Sunday moved with the clean efficiency of something long prepared. By 4 o'clock, the financial separations were complete, the new locks were confirmed, and my lawyer had filed the separation notice before close of business. Liam arrived at the Rosedale gate around 8 in the evening and stood in the cold buzzing the intercom for nearly 20 minutes. I watched on the security camera app. When he called my cell, I let it ring out. I had nothing left to say that couldn't be handled through a lawyer. The divorce was finalized 5 months later. We had signed a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Liam had made a small speech at the time about how it didn't bother him, how he intended to spend his life, proving he didn't need my money. I thought of that speech often in the months that followed. He left the marriage with his personal savings and nothing more. Aldercroft, the properties, the vehicles, the investment accounts, all mine, as the agreement clearly specified. The only thing the divorce cost me was time, and even that I recovered quickly. The Muskoka property I kept. I had considered selling it in a cold moment or two. In the end, I replaced every piece of furniture that had been touched, redesigned the master suite the way I'd always meant to, and spent a weekend alone there, in March, watching the ice break up on the lake, with a glass of Niagara Riesling and a book I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. It was one of the better weekends of my life. Aldercroft had its strongest year on record in the 12 months after the divorce. The correlation seemed straightforward. I stopped spending any portion of my attention managing someone else's sense of his own importance. I hired a new head of project operations, a woman named Paula, with 20 years of construction management behind her, and the department ran more smoothly within 1 quarter than it had in the previous 2 years. Tara's employment was terminated not long after the highway, for reasons documented separately by HR. I didn't involve myself in the details. I heard things over the years, the way you do when you live in a city that is smaller than it looks. Zoe passed most of it along, usually with the tone of someone who knows information isn't necessary but can't quite resist. Liam had tried to set up an independent practice after the separation. Without the Aldercroft name behind his work, clients were scarce. He picked up residential renovation contracts for a while. The last thing Zoe told me, about 2 years after the divorce, was that someone had spotted him managing a build in Brampton for a mid-range developer that used to compete with us. I told her I was glad he had something steady, and I meant it in the particular way you mean things when you have genuinely moved past them. There is one detail I return to sometimes. The tag Heuer I gave him for our 2nd anniversary. He wore it constantly, showed it at client meetings, mentioned it when he wanted to feel established. After the separation, he tried to sell it at a jeweler on Cumberland Street. The jeweler examined the piece carefully and handed it back. The case was accurate, he explained, beautiful work. But the internal movement was a replica, manufactured to look correct without being correct. Worth very little on the secondary market. I had bought him a convincing decoy. I am not entirely certain when I made that decision, or what I understood about him that I wasn't yet willing to name out loud. But something in me, from some early point, had known better than to hand him the real thing. He called it calculating when he found out. Maybe it was. Or maybe precision and calculation are the same quality, and which word you use depends entirely on which side of the decision you're standing on. Fletcher came into my life 4 years after the divorce, at a sustainable architecture symposium in Vancouver. He designed ecological buildings across British Columbia and laughed at things that were actually funny, which I had forgotten was a quality worth looking for. He moved to Toronto the following year. We married quietly at City Hall on a Tuesday afternoon, Walter and Zoe as witnesses. Then dinner at a small Italian place on College Street, where I'd been going since my 20s. It was the best decision I've made in my personal life, and I made it without any uncertainty at all. Last October, we were on the deck of the Muskoka property at sunrise, holding coffee, watching the light come across the water. Our daughter, she's 2 now, interested in every rock and pine cone along the shoreline, was still asleep inside. Walter was in the guest room, having driven up Friday evening and stayed too late, talking about nothing particularly important, which is the best kind of conversation. I looked out at the lake and understood something I hadn't been able to say cleanly until that moment. For a long time, I thought what Liam took from me was trust, or time, or the particular safety of believing your home is what it appears to be. But sitting on that deck, I could see that all of it had come back, without effort, without searching. The moment I stopped making space for the wrong person inside it. What he could not have reached, what no one can take from a woman who has built something from her own hands, is the thing underneath all of it. The part that knows when something is wrong before it can be named. The part that waits and watches and moves at exactly the right moment. The part that builds the house and holds the key and understands, even before the evidence is in hand, that she is the one who decides what happens on her own property. That part never needed protecting. It was doing the protecting the whole time.